Today, we're talking about something that often goes unrecognized but deeply impacts caregiving: trauma. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Hi, Dr. Lakelyn here. Welcome to Caregiver Chats. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an Honor Company. I'm so glad you're taking the time to join me. These conversations are a space for learning, reflection, and support. And I invite you to subscribe to Caregiver Chats on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, I love hearing from you. You can connect with me on Instagram at Caregiver Chats Podcast or email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. Caregiving is often emotional, personal, and sometimes stressful. But what people don't realize is that past experiences, especially trauma, can shape how we show up in caregiving. It can also affect how the person we're caring for responds as well. In fact, many older adults have experienced some form of trauma, including what are known as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And at the same time, caregiving itself brings up stress, emotions, and even past experiences for the caregiver. Today, we're talking about what it looks like when trauma shows up on both sides of the caregiving relationship and how we can begin to better understand it. That's why I'm honored to be joined today by Jean Hartnett. Jean brings more than 30 years of experience in senior care and now focuses on helping individuals and organizations understand trauma-informed care. As a bonus, Jean has provided Caregiver Chats listeners with an exclusive code to download the workbook she's created for free on her website. So be sure to check out the show notes for that specific discount code. I'm really grateful that you're here with me today, Jean Hartnett. You have so much experience in the aging space, and you have really dedicated your career to trauma-informed care and educating places that work with older adults, senior living, aging spaces, and families about this very important topic. So thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. You know, you and I have been talking about doing this together for a long time, and here we are. So I really appreciate this invitation because I think it's such an important topic.
Oh gosh, well, the pleasure is all mine. And so can you talk to me a little bit about when you realized, okay, this is something we need to talk about, because I know you've been in this space a while.
Oh, wow. That is such a great question. And I will answer it by saying that it's a fairly recent phenomena in terms of my recognition of just how much trauma plays into the family caregiving and caregiver dynamic. My background is that I started on the front line of care as a certified nursing assistant way back in the late 1980s. And of course, trauma wasn't talked about back then. If it was, trauma was about going to the emergency room for a gunshot wound or a motor vehicle accident. So we very much thought of trauma as kind of a medical thing and not a psychological or psychosocial thing. So I became aware of it when I was a nursing home administrator, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were publishing a public health campaign around trauma. So that's a government agency that looks at public health issues, of course. And then coinciding with that, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services was requiring that skilled nursing facilities become trauma-informed. And I was running a nursing home at the time, Lakelyn, and I looked at the language of that legislation and the regulation, and I thought, what am I supposed to do here? I'm supposed to understand what type of trauma occurred in the older adults' lives that live here in my nursing home and develop a care plan in order to mitigate against re-traumatization. Like, all of these words were so foreign to me. And as luck would have it, I suppose my personal life and my professional life were colliding at that moment, because I was in therapy for a childhood trauma that had occurred in my life. And I started connecting the two things together, the things that I was learning on my own personal trauma healing journey and applying that to the older adults that lived in the nursing home. And I thought, oh my goodness, if I've experienced some trauma in my life, certainly these 70-year-olds, these 80-year-olds have also experienced trauma in their lives.
Yeah.
So that got me really fired up to start bringing the language of trauma to the older adult space, to the family caregiving environment, because it is such an enriching topic once you dig into what trauma actually is and how to heal from it.
Wow. Well, I'm grateful that you have kind of taken on this space and this education role because as we were talking about before, as we were sitting here prepping for today, trauma is not new. It's
Right.
actually very common.
Yeah.
And so many older adults, as you mentioned, have experienced trauma.
Yeah.
And the terminology, if you want to look at it from like a clinical standpoint, can kind of sound jargony. But I think it could be helpful for those listening to talk and kind of unpack that word trauma
Yeah.
and the types of trauma that we're seeing in the aging population and throughout kind of our life course. Because from what I understand, it's more of the childhood traumas that are showing up in our later years. So
You
tell
are
us more.
so right about that. So for your listeners, I use a very simplistic definition of trauma. So the way that I talk about trauma in the workshops and keynote presentations I give is that trauma is an emotional reaction to a horrific event. So if you can just think about those things in your life where you've had an emotional response to a horrific event, that is a very general definition of what trauma is. To kind of unpack that a little bit deeper is we know that trauma is also defined as what's known as the 3 E's. So trauma is an experience that that has a lasting effect on us, and it's something that you can't seem to forget.
Yeah.
And because trauma is such a kind of a controversial topic, what happens is that individuals don't want to talk about the bad things that happen to them.
Right.
But those lasting effects linger in people. And we see that in the older adults that we serve. We see that even though we don't know their trauma history, we see the way that their behaviors kind of evolve when they move into a nursing home or an assisted living community. We see that the person that moved in 3 months ago has somehow made some sort of change.
Wow.
And we in long-term care don't really know how to unpack that change.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that behavior is linked back to the trauma that they experienced.
Wow. That, I think for so many of us that work in this space, it's kind of like an aha moment, like, wow.
Yeah.
Because so often when we talk about people's behaviors in kind of the aging space or in the dementia space, we're trying to put on our detective's hat and get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
And it might involve discovering some sort of traumatic event that they've experienced.
Yeah.
And I think too, a lot of times, even like the adult children don't know that this trauma took place because again, might be in their childhood years, before those adult children were ever a twinkle in their parents' eye, as they say.
Yeah.
Or the family caregiver, they might have experienced trauma within that family unit.
Yeah.
And how does that start to play out in a family caregiving role? So there's so many different avenues I know we're going to go down today. But I know we've talked, about what trauma is, but what are the types of trauma that are commonly discovered or experienced?
Well, there was a landmark study done in 1998 called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And prior to this landmark study, which I will get into because it's kind of the favorite thing that I like to talk about because like you mentioned, people have aha moments or light bulbs that go off once you start really learning about this. But prior to the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, we knew about post-traumatic stress disorder. So in 1980, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD was added to the DSM-5, which is a big catalog of all kind of the mental health diseases and types of things that people can have that can be treated. PTSD was put in that Bible or that dictionary of things that people experience. And that was largely based on soldiers that came back from war, that they would experience flashbacks, our Vietnam vets, our Korean vets, and even before that, World War I and World War II veterans had these types of symptoms where they experienced something, again, the E, they experienced something so traumatic that it had a lasting effect on them. And even though they're out of that situation, they're out of that environment, they're back home, those flashbacks cause the PTSD. So we sat with that definition for a long time and only applied PTSD to veterans of war. But it turns out that many of us, those of us that haven't gone to war, can also have post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And a lot of times what they found is women that were in domestic violence situations also had similar characteristics to that combat veteran. So we started broadening our lens, not only for veterans of war, individuals that are in domestic violence situations, but we started looking at a whole variety of things that happened to us when we were children. So the ACEs study done in 1998 by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that there are 10 categories of childhood adversity that many of us experience that directly impact the way that we matriculate into adulthood and older adulthood. So it's those things you can think of that would be adversities in childhood, such as child's physical abuse, child's sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, having a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member in your home, witnessing domestic violence against your mother, and having an incarcerated individual in your family that's incarcerated. So all of these categories they found, many of us have in our childhood. Like if you start thinking about maybe some of the things of the clients you've worked with, potentially those were in their childhood. And once you have 4 or more of those adversities of those categories, that's when it starts impacting the chronicity that you're going to have as an adult, mental health challenges you're going to have as an adult, and also dementia. So it really is important for us in senior living and senior care to really unpack what potentially could have happened in this older adult's life way back in the day. Yeah. That's showing up in their 80s, in their 70s, in their 80s, in their 90s, and really having an orientation to that. And, you know, you said it so perfectly, like when I discovered this, I became a whole new person in senior living, meaning I started looking at my job differently. I started looking at employees differently. I started looking at family caregivers differently, knowing that all of us have an ACE score. Yeah. And it's not a shameful thing to have an ACE score. And so I think that's the important part of really bringing this knowledge to our sector of healthcare is, you know, a mission that I'll do for as long as I live, quite frankly.
Well, and we're grateful that you're doing that work. And thank you for unpacking, you know, those different adverse childhood experiences, right? ACE, did I get it right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
And I think you made such a good point. It's not something to be shameful of. Yeah. But I think for maybe the current older generation, it's not something that was spoken about. Yeah. I think maybe my generation, a millennial, we're talking more about our mental health. We're a little more open. We've been seeking therapy more regularly than previous generations. But I think that what kind of makes this challenging is it's not something that was ever spoken about. No. Many people internalize this, the shame that's associated. They don't want to talk about it. And so it is showing up. But maybe they're not even recognizing that that's what it's tying back to. Yeah. And I think that, again, that's why it's so important for us to be having this conversation to learn about it. And if I look at it like through my family caregiver lens as well, just knowing that, okay, maybe my loved one went through something that I don't know about. And that's what's, you know, causing maybe a certain behavior, or maybe it can just help you at the very least be a little more empathetic towards the person that you're caring for.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really is something that orients you towards compassion. And, you know, I'm a former family caregiver. I cared for my parents until their end of life. And at the same time that I'm caring for them, I'm learning all of this. I'm learning all of this from kind of a scholastic standpoint, because I really took myself to trauma school. Yeah. And then I was also living it in my own life of unpacking the trauma that happened to me. And once I stepped into that family caregiving role, I brought those lenses into caring for mom and dad and really started to connect the dots on like, well, maybe this is why mom is doing this or dad is doing that.
Yeah.
And instead of it being like an, aw, shucks, this is really sad, it was a powerful family caregiving tool because I stopped asking what's wrong with them. And I started asking what happened to them. And it just really did. Even, that's such a personal example.
Yeah.
But I know that family caregivers throughout the nation can start really understanding ACEs and trauma and the language of it and how it shows up. Even if something happened when you were a 7-year-old girl and now you're 87, if it's unresolved, if it's unprocessed, if you haven't had a chance to verbalize it in a therapeutic environment or symbolically through writing or creating art, those memories live with you. And we see them show up so often in healthcare and in our, especially at the end of life. When I was a caregiver on the front line of care in the 80s, the way we managed pain was to look at pain of the death and dying as physical pain. We saw individuals writhing in bed, tears strolling down their face. On the front line of care, we did everything that we could, call the nurse for more pain meds, reposition, cool cloth, ice chips, all the things. And even all of the tricks that we had on the front line of care could not resolve the pain that we were recognizing. And so now that I'm trauma aware and trauma informed, I start thinking to myself, I bet that wasn't physical pain.
Right.
That's emotional pain that hasn't had an opportunity to come out. I mean, why do we say rest in peace after all? I think we say it because so few do. I really do. And now with this knowledge, we can change the care rubric so dramatically.
Wow. I loved what you said about looking at it through a new lens of, what happened to them and not why is this happening now? Like, just kind of taking that step back and looking at it from that holistic approach. Because I think you're right. So much of what we do in healthcare, in senior care is, treat the physical, health, the physical, but there is so much emotional that can manifest as physical too, that I think we definitely need to kind of dig into and to treat kind of from that holistic perspective.
Yeah. Well, I have to applaud your generation. I mean, and I say this in almost every workshop in that we really are getting more comfortable with the language of mental health and largely starting with millennials on down, this idea that people want to talk about what happened to them. I'm Gen X, so I'm the generation who knew I had trauma, but I didn't know what to do with it. And your generation and the subsequent generations are really showing me how. And so we can show other generations older than us how. I think you said, you've had a conversation recently with maybe someone who's a baby boomer and they're like, well, I've never really even considered trauma. But you just show a little bit of how it may be manifesting and the light bulbs go off.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I, again, going back to, I know we've been talking about healthcare and senior living, but kind of zeroing in on family caregivers.
Yeah.
Can you give some examples? Because people might be thinking, okay, maybe this is showing up in my loved one, maybe not. Can you maybe give some examples of trauma that you have seen or heard stories about, just to kind of help us help this kind of topic come to life in a real practical way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, first, by answering that question, it's important to recognize that the family caregiving rubric or the family caregiving relationship is a very complex relationship.
Yes.
And it's fraught with emotion and it's fraught with confusion. And we as family caregivers, again, I kind of put myself in that group, but family caregivers in general, those that I communicate, want to do the best job that they can on behalf of their parents, on behalf of their grandparents. And we find ourselves in these roles that we are incapable of really doing well. because we don't have the tools and the resources. It's navigating our long-term care system and the healthcare system, which in and of itself can exacerbate the symptoms of trauma, the fatigue, the burnout, the moral injury, all of those types of things. But what I've seen in the family caregiving dynamic is, especially if there are multiple children taking care of family care of parents, of aging parents, is that those roles that we had in the family, whether it's, the smartest one or the talky one or, the
troublemaker,
the troublemaker one, like all of those roles come back.
Yeah.
And you start kind of being aligned with those again. And with that, when you're called a name that you were, as a 50-year-old, that you were called when you were 10 years old, those memories of what it was like to grow up in this family unit start to really come to light. And that's when the conflict starts. And that's when the care for the parents kind of go by the wayside because the siblings are in conflict with one another. The trauma occurs for the older adult because they're losing so much. And they're cognizant that they're losing so much, whether it be the ability to think the way they used to, the way that they used to mow the lawn or go to the grocery store and get their hair fixed. So the trauma there really is this recognition that I am at end of life. I am losing a lot of my cognitive capacity, my physical capacity, the things I used to do in the home. And so you really see if trauma is an event, this is a slow walk into that event because it happens so gradually.
Yeah.
Yet the older adult that you're caring for as a family caregiver is very cognizant that they're unable to do what they used to be able to do. So that's probably the most prominent way and the most logical way. I think what isn't logical is that we haven't talked about that as being a trauma.
Yeah.
We've talked about it as being a loss.
Right.
But we haven't gone as far to say that this can be experienced as a traumatic event for an older adult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then I think you said, for some it's a slow walk, but some it's a very specific event, like a stroke or other health event or a fall. And all of a sudden overnight, they experience that loss. And so that to me is very clearly a trauma, a traumatic event for them and for likely the whole family, because then the caregivers are thrust into the role and overnight their role changes.
Yeah.
So I think that this is opening my eyes to the fact that, that in and of itself is very traumatic as well.
It really is. And you've got to think about also, and I know you think about this, but again, we've never talked about it in the framework of it being a trauma. But when an individual becomes a family caregiver, they too experience loss. Many times they have to leave their jobs. Many times they leave that financial stability that they had with that full-time or part-time job.
True.
And so there's just a myriad of loss that happens for that family caregiver as well. And you're just trying to manage so many different things, including your own life. Yeah. And your own life kind of goes on the back burner. And this is your new role. And it's a cacophony, I think, of, again, I say fraught with problems. And I know that sounds negative. I don't want it to. Yeah. Because I know family caregivers are out there every single day, going home with the casserole, going home with the pill cassettes, going home with the gait belt. There's so many caregivers that are doing so much for their parents or their grandparents. And I don't want it to sound negative. I actually want to give a boost to those and show that this is a hard job and that it feels hard because of the family dynamics that can occur in that family caregiving relationship.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's validating too, because if you're listening and you're a family caregiver and you're like, yeah, this is hard. Yeah. Just saying it out loud. Yeah. Saying, what I'm doing is hard. And many people say I would never change it because I love the person I'm caring for. They gave so much to me. This is my opportunity to give back. I'm growing as a person. I'm stretching in ways I didn't know were possible. There is, I think, some meaning and beauty that comes from caregiving. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that it isn't hard.
Absolutely.
And I think just to recognize that can be just that tiny little weight off the shoulders to know, okay, other caregivers are out there and they say it's hard. Whew, I've been feeling it.
Yes.
And so, I feel validated in that way. So I think that those are some great examples, Jean. But I would be also curious to know about these ACEs, the adverse childhood events that might be showing up in an older adult's life or in a caregiving dynamic within kind of the family caregiving structures. Do you have any examples of that as well?
Yes, I do actually. So there was a woman that was living in one of the communities that I managed and led. And I talk about this particular woman because, of course, I became very close with her. And what I knew about her living situation prior moving into assisted living was that she was living at home alone for, gosh, I think it was nearly 7 to 10 years without her spouse. So she was still very healthy, very vibrant, but it felt like it was time to make that transition, at least for her to move into, it was kind of like assisted living, but very independent assisted living, if you will. And when she came to us, she was a healthy weight. She was very active. And within, a couple of weeks to a couple of months, she lost a significant amount of weight. Wow. And we were really concerned about that because, of course, weight loss is one of those items that just, if you don't get on top of it in an older adult's body, it can really continue and lead to falls and lead to other types of health conditions. And so we really worked with her. We worked with her in the dining services to really understand what are those perfect foods for you? What do you like to eat? And then we stepped back after we made many modifications and still things weren't hitting the mark. If she ate, she only ate a couple of bites. And what we discovered in this situation is that it wasn't the food that we were serving her. It was the environment in which we were serving. So she had lived alone for so long. Oh, wow. She was only accustomed to eating alone. So this idea of eating in front of others was a real difficult thing for her to do. Okay, so that's kind of step one. Okay, so we don't like eating in front of others, but why? And we uncovered it a little bit more. And in talking to her, it wasn't that we were asking her questions. Like when you uncover trauma, it's never in a clinical environment. It really is at the bingo table. Yeah. It really is before and after the church service when older adults start telling their stories. And what we talked about in one particular aha moment was that Jan grew up impoverished. And she was from a huge family. And she was somewhere from the girls' lineup, as far as I remember, kind of towards the end of the family. So it was always this idea that the men ate first and the women got what they got. And so it wasn't just that Jan was alone without her spouse eating alone. It was also that way back in the day, it was kind of conditioned in her to let others eat before she did. She grew up on a farm. The men would come in from the field, and of course they got fed first. And I think it's just stories like that where you're like, okay, I didn't ask her, how did she eat as a child? Yeah. I didn't ask her if she ate last. She told me. Yeah. And so that's the trick of really uncovering a person's trauma is you've got to listen to their stories and connect the dots to what's occurring right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think that goes back to this whole notion of person-centeredness that is kind of the cornerstone for our, industry. And really getting to know the person that you're caring for and to learn their history. And that can be so helpful in how you care for them and support them. And I think what is so unique about family caregivers is they often know the person very well. But I think that there's also a whole side to that person that you don't know because unless you're like their sister and maybe grew up in the same household and you're caring for a sister or maybe like your cousin. But if you're not of the same generation, you might not have known them for a period of their life and know some of those family secrets that have been kept. And they can start to show up. Absolutely. And especially, I wondered if we could maybe talk about dementia a little bit because I think sometimes we see what we deem behaviors come about in dementia, that now I'm like starting to rethink it all, like questioning everything. Like,
I know.
Could some of these behaviors be tied to some of these ACEs that you were talking about? Like, I think about, bathing is such an intimate and personal thing. And having somebody else step into that space and help you with that. Well, if you experience any sort of sexual abuse or things of that nature, that could reopen that trauma or bring up that trauma within.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that that's something you're seeing in this space.
I am very much so. And I will tell you that again, this is just why it's so important for our people in our profession to understand trauma. Because when I was providing care to individuals that have dementia back in the 80s, and we had an entire neighborhood called St. Anthony's at Madonna Rehabilitation Hospital. And it was a groundbreaking program for the time. But when an older adult came up to me and she would say, "Where is my husband?" And I knew that her husband had passed away, I would say, "Gladys, your husband is dead. Remember?" And then it feels so wrong right now.
Well, when we know better, we do better.
Right. That's exactly right. Yes. And then, the way that we do it now is to redirect Gladys to say, let's go make cookies or let's go to the bathroom and, maybe you need to get a drink of water or whatever it is. Like we're trying to treat what they're telling us with something that could be what they're really asking for.
Right. That unmet need.
An unmet need.
Yeah.
When in reality, what they want to hear from you is that you believe them. If they're telling you, "My husband is late, he's not here," you say, "Gladys, I believe you. I believe that your husband is late. Now let's go sit down. Let's get in a safe environment where we can talk more about this." And one of the things that is so important in the caregiving role is this idea of being able to co-regulate with an individual. So Gladys, in this situation, when you think about stress response activation, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, when our individuals that have dementia are demonstrating those stress response activations, we have to be almost like the parent. And I mean that not in an infantilizing way, but the parent in terms of attempting to co-regulate like we do with our babies, to really meet them where they're at and to be that calm voice, to be that calm person. But of course, the only way to do that is to have caregivers who aren't in their stress response activation. Yeah. So it's this idea that on both sides of that caregiving coin, you have to be really in tune with what's happening in your body in these stressful situations. And so knowing all of that, I'm hoping that answers your question. I kind of got off track in terms of
no, these are good examples. I think that, again, all of these examples are just helping this come to life.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes when we're presented with a new concept that is so, I don't even know the word that I'm trying to say, but like profound. Like this is trauma-informed care to me seems so profound. It's probably, this new era of how we engage with the older population, we engage as a caregiver. So to kind of wrap our mind around it, I think we need these examples. We need people to show us the right way to respond and to show up for these individuals. And I think you made also a great point, as the caregiver, you could be in that stress response mode because of trauma you've experienced.
Absolutely.
So sometimes this concept seems just like so big. It's like, what can I do to make a difference?
Yeah.
And so I know we have family caregivers listening, probably some professionals too, which we're so grateful. Everyone is here. But how can we make this digestible for a family caregiver? Or what are some maybe simple things they can start to do in their daily care routines with their loved one to be aware of this possibility of trauma, or to be more trauma informed, both for the person they're caring for and for themselves?
Yeah. I think I'll tell you from a personal example, I became more aware of what my body felt like in almost every situation. And it's this idea of really checking in with myself. I mean, when we're trauma survivors, we like to check out. We like to eat the food. This was me. Eat the food, be the workaholic, like anything and everything I could do to not feel what I'm feeling inside. And when you are moving towards knowing a little bit more about your own trauma history and really starting to unpack it in that way, it's really important not to check out, but to check in. Like, what am I feeling? And what's interesting about doing that is sometimes we don't know. We can't even name, I feel joyful, I feel sad, I feel rage. Like, we are so disconnected from our brain and our body, because that's what trauma does, is it disconnects the brain and the body. And what we do, we reach for the cell phone, or we reach for the cigarette or the can of beer, whatever it is that's going to distract us. And because we want to disassociate.
Yeah.
And so the first step is for caregivers to really just what I call the new pain assessment, which is pay attention inside now to really understand what's happening in your body. And like I feel grief in my lungs. I feel excitement in my belly. I feel stress in my head. Like, I know that now. Yeah. I never knew that before. I was just like, I feel like crap today. But now, since I know where it shows up in my body, I can heal myself through breathing or lying down, going to a yoga class. So you don't have to spend hours and hours and years in therapy. You just have to start listening to yourself and trusting yourself. That's the first step for family caregivers.
I think that's so helpful.
Yeah.
Pay attention. Inside now pain.
Yeah,
I like
pain.
that acronym.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say, Lakelyn, one of the things that I really started to identify with as a family caregiver, because I was the perfect person to care for mom and dad. I was a certified nursing assistant, a nursing home administrator. I studied this as in my master's degree. So I felt like I was the perfect person to take care of mom and dad. And I was. To a point. Yeah. When it became too much for me, I had to advocate for myself. And that's the other key takeaway for family caregivers. You have to advocate for yourself. And I started saying to people in my family, just because I can doesn't mean I should. And so I needed to take a break. I needed to come back to Omaha and have some level of respite and not feel guilty about it.
I think that is such great advice, to just start checking in with yourself and becoming aware. And that self-awareness is so important. And I think those little ways, those examples you gave of the breath work, stepping out in nature, whatever is going to kind of ground you, bring you back to your center. I think that is such a helpful tip. And what is so interesting, I've listened to you speak on this topic before. So you haven't brought it up yet, but I know, just then you gave some examples of how sometimes we bury our trauma with things like alcohol or eating or smoking, those kinds of things. And as we get older, sometimes we're on a medication where we can no longer drink, or we're moved into a community living setting where you're not allowed to smoke. And so are those some of the things that start to, when they're taken away, start to kind of uncover some of these traumas? Because I'm thinking from a caregiver's perspective, if they're like, gosh, mom moved in to this nursing facility and all of a sudden, we're seeing behaviors come up in her that we've never seen before. What is this? Could it be that there's this trauma that is showing up?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's that idea that when you feel those feelings, those emotions, those sensations, if you're not checking in with yourself, we go to the cell phone, we go to the Haagen-Dazs, we go to, whatever it is to cope and soothe. Yeah. Our coping mechanisms are put in place to protect us, just like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn is a protector from danger. Our coping mechanisms really bring us down from when we've been escalated to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. When we start feeling those feelings, we don't want to feel them. What do I do to cope and soothe? And when individuals move into a nursing home, or like you said, in a family caregiving, when the medications they're taking, the doctor says no more alcohol. Well, my goodness, that's how mom or dad coped. That's how uncle and aunt coped, is they had, they drank a bottle of wine together every single night. This is very typical. But when that's taken away and you don't have other resources, other coping mechanisms, then of course you're going to start acting out. Of course you are. I mean, when I go to a nursing home or assisted living community, I'm just going to tell them right off the bat, there's certain months in my life that I know that you better not have like dining hours, because I'm going to need like 24/7 food service. Like I cope and soothe by food. And so if the dining room is closed, I am going to find a way to manage the way that I feel. And so it's really recognizing that yes, what are the things that have been taken away from someone? And is that causing them to act in a different way because they don't know how to manage their emotions or their sensations in their bodies?
That's so interesting. Gosh, we could keep talking about this forever. And I'm like, do we keep going? Do I bring us home? I don't know yet. But I think what would be helpful is maybe to talk about some resources around this topic.
Yeah.
Because maybe people are like, oh my gosh, I need to learn more. I'm hungry to learn more. What would be some resources for that group? And then maybe if people are seeing this showing up in their family caregiving environment, what kinds of things should they be looking into for support? So maybe let's start with those that want to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell your listeners how I did it. Once I got excited about this topic, I just Googled my brains out. And I found so many resources, whether it be Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, who was the first Surgeon General of California, talking about ACEs in a TED Talk. I watched that ad nauseum. I found Fritzi Hortzman from the Compassion Prison Project. Fritzi goes into California. Again, California, they're leading the way. California prisons, and works with incarcerated men to help them understand ACEs. And she does this wonderful exercise called Step Inside the Circle, where they're out in a prison yard and everybody's spread out in this giant circle, about 200 men, 100 to 200 men. And she starts reading, if before the age of 13 or 18, this happened to you, step inside the circle. And by the end of the 10 ACEs questions, that huge circle is a small circle, because an overwhelming majority of the individuals have had 10 ACEs. And so it's just really getting inspired. I mean, those are art. Speaking is an art, filmmaking is an art, which is what Fritzi has done. So the portal in is however you want to get in. If you like research, go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website. Go to the SAMHSA website, which stands for the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. The NIH has a ton of research on trauma. So if you like the artistic way, if you like reading books, I've got a whole bibliography that I can send your listeners that can lead them towards really understanding what trauma is from a fiction and nonfiction standpoint. So there's a ton of portals in, and I can't get enough of it. This morning before the podcast, I was reading something new and listening to someone, a neuropsychologist, talk about bullying and racism, and is that a trauma, and what happens to the brain when a child is bullied.
Wow.
All of these things that are just so interesting. And it's a topic that, I do this, that there's no bottom to it.
Yeah.
And so it just depends on what a person, how they like to learn. If they like to watch to learn or read to learn, there's just so many ways to understand this topic better.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I'll be curious, like, as we progress through this age of technology and AI, if there will be new ACEs added for older generations, like the bullying and especially like cyberbullying or other kind of topics that are impacting children with the use of social media and AI. So interesting. That's a tangent for another whole podcast. But what about family caregivers? If they're feeling like, oh gosh, this seems very overwhelming to me, or I want to learn more about maybe how this is showing up in myself or a loved one.
Yeah.
What kind of resources would you point them to?
I would definitely point them to, have a workbook on my website that individuals can access. And really what it is for me, or from in my experience, both, working in older adult care in the institutional environment and then with family caregivers, is that the most important thing to focus on is yourself. And so what my workbook does is leads an individual through an understanding of childhood trauma, of theories like this theory called internal family systems and attachment theory. It's all in the workbook from a theory standpoint. But then in each section is a section where an individual is able to integrate what they've learned through writing prompts or other types of ways that you can really start applying what you're learning from the workbook to your life. So I call this almost, I should rename the workbook, Jean's Greatest Hits, because it's everything that I tried, everything that I did in order to heal myself. And I think all the time, whether it's in the healthcare environment, long-term care, or family caregiving, we're always looking for a cure.
Right.
But really what we ought to be looking at is how to be healed. And there's so much literature around how to be healed. You think of a wound that needs to be healed, and trauma in Greek is wound.
Wow.
And so if we think about that metaphor alone, healing is very individualistic. My wounds heal differently than yours because of the way my body works. So finding your own way through, and the workbook is a great way to get people started if they'd like.
Fantastic. And your website, would you share that with us? So
I will. It's www.radicalsabbaticalcare.com.
Wonderful. And we'll be, of course, sure to include that in the show notes so that people can connect with you, continue to learn more. I know you're on LinkedIn. We can follow you there on your website, and reach out via email too if people are interested in diving deeper on this topic of trauma-informed care. And I just want to say thank you for being here, for joining me. This is actually the first time we're recording in our studio, which is so fun. Yes. And so to have you as our first guest is just so meaningful to me, because you're a fellow Omaha person, and also just because I really admire you and the work you do, and feel very grateful to have you in my circle.
Likewise, Lakelyn. I mean, you're on a pedestal in my book. You always have been, and that's not going to change. Oh,
well, thank you again so much for being here and for sharing about this really important topic.
You're very welcome.
I want to sincerely thank Jean for sharing her insights and compassion with us today. This conversation is such an important reminder that caregiving is not just about the tasks. It's about understanding the whole person and their life experiences. And when we begin to understand trauma in both those we care for and within ourselves, we can provide more compassionate care. If today's episode resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with another caregiver who may need to hear this conversation. And Jean has provided an exclusive discount code for her trauma workbook just for Caregiver Chats listeners. You can find the code to download her workbook for free in the description. Be sure to connect with me on Instagram at Caregiver Chats Podcast for episode updates, caregiving tips, and more. You can also reach me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. Thanks for listening, and please remember to take good care of yourself while you care for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, visit homeinstead.com to learn more.